9 days before the 2006 season even started, the FIA's top technical official sat in a room with all 10 Formula One teams and made a quiet admission. The energy rules might not work. He told them he had backup plans. He told them to be patient. And then Melbourne happened, and every concern the drivers had raised during testing landed on live television in front of 80 million viewers. Cars losing power mid-straight, overtakes that had nothing to do with bravery or racecraft. The reigning world champion calling these the worst Formula One cars ever built. At least that is what everyone thought the story would be about. A bad weekend, a rough start to a new era, something the sport could ride out. It was not, because what the FIA revealed the day after the race turned a difficult opening weekend into a full-blown regulatory crisis, with a deadline that lands this Saturday in Shanghai. Melbourne was supposed to be the proof of concept, the first race under the new regulations on a real circuit in real conditions with real championship stakes. The FIA had already made a precautionary adjustment before the weekend, cutting the recoverable energy limit from 8.5 to 8 megajoules because Albert Park's layout with its almost 70% full throttle profile was one of the 4 worst circuits on the calendar for energy recovery. They saw the Bahrain testing data. They knew the track would be brutal. They made their move. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not, because even with the reduced limit, Melbourne fell apart. The cars were 3.3 seconds slower per lap than the 2025 generation. That is not a marginal loss. In Formula One terms, 3 seconds is the gap between a championship contender and a car fighting to get out of the first qualifying session. These are supposed to be the fastest single-seaters on the planet, and they just got meaningfully slower overnight. The qualifying sessions told one story. The race told a worse one. Drivers were managing energy from the formation lap onward, nursing deployment through every sector, lifting off the throttle well before braking zones just to claw back enough charge to make it through the next straight with something resembling full power. The onboard cameras showed the telemetry bars bouncing between full deployment and empty, sometimes within the same straight. Fans watching at home could see it happening in real time. And the commentary team spent half the race trying to explain why cars were slowing down on straights with no cars ahead of them. 120 overtakes happened during the race, triple the number from the same event a year earlier. And no, I am not making that up. On paper, the FIA could have pointed to that figure and called the whole weekend a success. Problem solved. Except anyone who actually watched the race knew exactly what those overtakes were. They were battery cycles. The Mercedes driver and the Ferrari driver traded the lead back and forth across multiple laps, not because they were racing each other, but because their energy deployment was out of phase. One car had charge, the other did not. Then it flipped. Then it flipped again. It looked like wheel-to-wheel combat on a highlight reel. It felt like watching 2 phones take turns dying on the same charger. Think about that for a second. The marquee battle of the opening race of a new era was decided by software timing, not by which driver braked later or carried more speed through a corner. Someone saw this coming. Multiple drivers raised alarms during testing and kept raising them louder through the Melbourne weekend. The 4-time world champion called the new cars anti-racing. He compared them to Formula E on steroids. After crashing out of the first qualifying session and recovering to 6th in the race, he sat in front of the media and said, "You cannot drive naturally. You have to be on the throttle as little as possible everywhere just to save the battery." For him, that had very little to do with racing. The reigning champion was even more blunt. When a journalist asked if there was anything he enjoyed about the new cars, he paused. 7 seconds of dead silence on camera. Then he said, "No, not really." He called them the worst cars ever and flagged a genuine safety concern. Speed differentials of 30 to 50 kilometers per h between cars that have battery charge and cars that do not. When someone hits someone at that speed difference, he said, "You are going to fly. You are going to go over the fence, and you are going to do a lot of damage." The 2-time champion brought the most quotable moment of the whole weekend. He pointed to turn 12 at the Bahrain circuit during testing, historically a flat-out courage test, and noted, "The cars now go through it 50 kilometers per hour slower because of harvesting demands. The chef can drive the car at that speed." That might be the single best one-liner of the 2026 season so far. And if that were the only problem, the FIA might have survived the weekend with nothing worse than some angry press conferences and awkward television interviews. But then the man at the center of the regulations broke his silence. Russell would look back on Melbourne and wish he had made a different call about one thing only. He dominated the race for Mercedes, and in doing so, became the only driver on the grid who publicly said the cars were manageable. His framing was that once you get your head around it, it becomes a new normal. He acknowledged the lift and coast was probably not pure racing. But Mercedes won. Their driver called it fine, and the narrative split gave the FIA just enough diplomatic cover to move at their own pace instead of scrambling. Up to this point, the story had been about drivers venting frustration after a messy opening race. That was about to flip. March 9, 2026. The day after the race, Nicholas Tumbazis, the FIA's single-seater director, confirmed through multiple publications that formal discussions on energy management changes would begin after the Chinese Grand Prix on March 15th. Implementation could come as soon as the Japanese Grand Prix on the 29th. 2 weeks, that is the window. And he revealed 3 specific technical options that the governing body had been developing quietly behind the scenes. His phrasing was pointed. We have a few aces up our sleeves on that, which we did not want to introduce ahead of the first race as a knee-jerk reaction, and which we will review with the teams after China. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about how the FIA has handled this crisis. They had fixes ready before the season started. They deliberately held them back. Their calculation was that acting before Melbourne would look panicked, so they let the race play out and took the hit. Whether that was strategic patience or a miscalculation that handed critics a week of ammunition is the question hanging over the Chinese Grand Prix paddock right now. The teams, for their part, were aligned. Tumbazis confirmed that all 10 agreed unanimously to stick with the current setup for the opening races and review after gathering real data. Nobody wanted a knee-jerk reaction. Everybody wanted evidence. Melbourne provided it, and China will either confirm it or complicate it. The procedural reality matters here. Energy management changes fall under the technical regulations, which means the FIA can push them through without a full World Motorsport Council vote if they are framed as safety-related or clarification-level adjustments. Super clipping limit changes are a parameter shift, not a regulation rewrite. That is why Japan is a realistic target for Option A. It can be done fast without the political machinery that normally slows down mid-season rule changes. Options B and C are heavier. A deployment reduction changes the competitive balance between manufacturers, and any power increase requires hardware-level adjustments that teams would need weeks to implement and validate. The 5-week gap after Japan is not just convenient, it may be structurally necessary for anything beyond a quick fix. If you are finding this breakdown useful, consider subscribing. This channel covers the technical side of Formula One every week, from regulation changes to the engineering that decides championships. Alright, so here's where things get uncomfortable for the entire sport. 3 options. Each one carries a different cost, and the FIA has to pick its direction before the cars even arrive in Shanghai. Option A is the quickest and cleanest fix. Raise the super clipping limit from 250 kilowatts to 350. Super clipping happens when the electrical motor harvests energy, while the driver stays at full throttle, pulling power from the rear wheels back into the battery. Right now, the rules cap that harvesting at 250 kilowatts.